What would your family bring in their covered wagon? As much as you could pack in. It was necessary to leave behind everything that you didn't really need, especially if it was heavy. The oxen and horses pulling the wagons had a hard time just walking across the country. If the wagons were too heavy, the oxen could die from exhaustion. It was very important to try to figure out how much food you would need for the 5 or 6 months you would be traveling. There was no supermarket you could go to when you ran out of supplies, so you would bring flour and yeast for baking bread. Your family would also bring crackers, cornmeal, bacon, eggs, dried meat and dried fruit, potatoes, rice, beans, and a big barrel of water. They might even have some chocolate for special treats. If your family had cows, you could bring them along for milk and meat. Your family also knew that they would be able to hunt for more meat on the trail, and that they would find wild berries and honey and some vegetables along the way. Pioneers made their own clothing, so your family brought along cloth to sew with, needles, thread, pins and scissors, and leather to fix worn-out shoes. You had to make your own repairs, so you brought saws, hammers, axes, nails, string, and knives. For daily chores, you would bring things like soap, wax for making candles, lanterns, and wash bowls. Many people brought tents to sleep in outside the wagons. If they hunted buffalo on the trail, they would often use the skins for making blankets. With the fur on the inside, a buffalo skin was warm and soft. It was also important not to forget medicines in case somebody got sick on the trip. Nobody forgot plates, knives, forks, spoons, cups, and pots and pans. They were kept in a special box attached to the back of the wagon. What was the best time of year to start the trip? This was a very important question. The answer had to be just right, or there might be many problems on the trip. The answer is that you had to start from Independence, Missouri, or nearby, in May, because of the oxen and cows and the weather. Can you guess why? If you started too early, the spring rains would have made so much mud that the wagon wheels would get stuck. Then you would have to spend days digging yourself out. Also, if you started too early, the grass would not have grown tall enough and thick enough to feed all the cattle along the way. After the pioneers ran out of the hay they had brought with them in their wagons, the cattle would grow weak and might even die from hunger. The whole trip would take about 5 or 6 months. So if you started too late, you might be caught crossing mountains in a heavy winter snowfall. This happened to some wagons. On one trip, some of the pioneers had to camp in the mountains through the winter until spring, when the snows melted. Then they were able to travel on. Some died from cold and hunger during the long wait. The perfect time of year to start was in the spring, after the rains, when the sun was shining and the grass was growing tall. How would you cross rivers when there were no bridges? It wasn't easy crossing rivers back in the 1840s. The covered wagons started west from towns on the Missouri River. So, often, the very first thing you had to do on the trip was to cross a river. One place to start from was a town called Independence. Independence was a small town with a few farms, some stores that made and fixed wagons and wheels, and many people sleeping in tents waiting to begin their trip west. Large, flat boats called scows would take the wagons across the Missouri River. But the horses, cows, and oxen had to swim across because they couldn't fit on the scows. The covered wagon had blocks of wood placed in front and in back of its wheels so that it wouldn't roll off the scow. Once the wagons crossed the Missouri River into Kansas and Nebraska, the pioneers were in Indian territory. Sometimes Indians had rafts and would ferry you across rivers. You would have to pay them with money or beads or something else they wanted. Sometimes you crossed rivers on rafts that you would help to build. You would tie together willow branches and put thick, long grasses called rushes on top. Then you would roll the wagon onto the raft and ferry it across the river. Most of the time you would seal the wagon tight by filling in all the cracks in the wood with tar or candle wax mixed with ashes. Children helped make the wax paste, and put it in the open spaces in the wooden planks. Sometimes you would cover the inside with animal skins to make the wagon even more waterproof. Then you would take the wheels off and push the wagon into the water. It would float across the river like a fat, flat boat. Children usually rode inside the wagon. 2 or 3 men also rode inside and steered the wagon with long poles. Others would ride horses into the water and try to steer the wagon from the outside. It could take over an hour to get across a river this way. If there were a lot of wagons in your wagon train, it sometimes took 5 days for everybody to get across. Sometimes wagons tipped over and everything inside was lost in the river. And sometimes the river flowed so fast that a wagon was dragged away and you couldn't catch it. If that happened, you and your family would probably ride with other families in the wagon train. How far would you travel in a day? On many days, you would travel 10 to 15 miles. If it was muddy and raining hard, you might make 1 mile in a whole day. Today, if you are driving in a car on the highway, you usually travel 65 miles in 1 hour. In a covered wagon, it might take you 6 or even 7 days to go as far as you can today in 1 hour. You would usually have to get up very early to start traveling in the wagons. Most people got up around 4 o'clock in the morning when it was still dark. First, they would start the fire so that they could cook breakfast. Then they would round up the cattle and start to load up the wagons with the tents, blankets, pots, and pans. The wagons would start moving by 7 o'clock in the morning and travel until lunchtime. Then you would rest for an hour or 2. After lunch, you would travel again until about 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 o'clock at night. Finally, you would stop until the next day. After 5 or 6 months, you would have traveled more than 2,000 miles. Today, that would take about 3 or 4 days in a car and 3 to 4 hours in an airplane. Would you ride in the wagon for the whole trip? No. In fact, you probably wouldn't ride for even most of the way. If you ever had a chance to ride in a covered wagon for more than an hour, you would know why. Too bumpy. There were no smooth highways or roads back in the 1840s. Sometimes you made your own trail by being the first wagon to go over a piece of ground. Other times you rode in the ruts made by other wagon wheels. You could feel every bump when you sat in the wagon. There were no cushioned seats, just wooden boards covered with a few blankets. Much of the time, you would walk next to the wagon. The wagons traveled very slowly, so you could easily keep up with them. When your feet got very tired, then you might climb up for a ride for a while. And sometimes you might want to ride in the wagon just to get the view from high up. The drivers would often walk alongside the oxen. They didn't use reins. They would shout and sometimes use a whip. But you wouldn't hit the animals. You would just crack the whip over their heads to make them go the way you wanted. What were the dangers and difficulties of the trip? One of the biggest problems was mud. Sometimes it would rain for days on the prairies, and then there would be mud, mud, and more mud. You could sink right up to your knees in mud. And if you could sink, so could the oxen, cows, and horses. When the sun came out, most of the mud would dry up in a few hours. Sometimes, though, the wagon wheels would still be stuck. Then the children would help gather long grasses. You would lay them across the ground in front of the wagon wheels. Then the oxen would pull from the front, and people would push from behind. The wheels would turn onto the grass and slowly come up out of the mud. The opposite problem is when the ground is too dry. Then there would be dust. So much dust that it would get in your eyes, your mother's eyes, your father's eyes, and the cattle's eyes. The dust would be so thick that you could hardly see your hand in front of your face. When that happened, sometimes you had to stop traveling because you couldn't see the trail at all. Most of the time, though, you just kept going anyway and hoped you were going the right way. Another problem was sickness. Some people became very ill with high fevers and aches and pains. Both grown-ups and children got diseases called cholera and malaria. Sometimes they died on the trip. You would pass many grave markers by the side of the trail as your wagon went by. Today there is medicine to keep you from getting these diseases and to cure you if you do get them. People didn't know as much about diseases and medicines in the 1840s as they do today.